Welcome to the PB&J podcast, where we talk about topics and issues relevant to the church today. Before we begin this episode, be sure to be sure to subscribe, and also share this. It really helps with the channel. We really appreciate it. And also leave a comment, either down below or through social media or through email, if that's your thing. We'll have the information in the description. Let us know what you think about this episode, and also let us know if you have any ideas about what you'd like us to talk about. And with that, we're glad you're with us on this episode. Let's jump in.
Hello. Welcome to our show. Tonight, we're going to do something we've not done on this podcast before. We're going to do something a little different, and we're going to ask something of you as an audience that we've not really asked in this same, most explicit way. Tonight, we're going to ask you to work a little bit. And what I mean by that is that we're going to ask you to think a little harder and engage a little more and discuss and talk a little more about what we're going to be talking about and going over tonight than we've done before. You see, we're going to ask you to get a little uncomfortable. And as we get a little further in the podcast, you'll see a little bit more what we mean by that. Ultimately, though, what we're asking is for you guys to try to earn a little bit of what we're going to talk about tonight. As you'll see, when we go through the book of Job, a big portion of this is going to be dialogue. And that's going to have a lot of implications about what we talk about. So we're not going to spoon feed you simple answers. If you're looking for a prepackaged gift where you have one thought that you can take away and summarize, that's probably not going to be tonight. But if you're looking for questions that you can ask yourselves and think about, if you're looking for questions that you can reflect on and that can change you over time, I think we absolutely have something in store for you.
Yeah. And this is something that is characteristic of wisdom literature in general, which is why we're taking this approach. Because as we studied this, we realized, we actually wouldn't be fair to the book of Job and its genre if we made things easy. Because the thing is, especially with the dialogues in Job, there's not always a clear winner or loser. There's not always a clear definition of who's right and who's wrong in what they say, because throughout the conversations there's a lot of wise sayings and truths that can be beneficial to reflect on. And so the thing about wisdom literature is the truth seems to be intentionally obscured, as if it's almost indicating to the reader that one must do the work of wisdom and discernment in order to attain and appreciate the truth of what's being said. And so in that spirit, that's why we're taking that approach today, and giving you the warning that we've given you. So in light of that, I think it's good if we go ahead and jump in. So we'll begin here. We finished last time with the end of Job chapter 2, which is the end of the narrative section in the introduction. So we have everything set up. Job has lost everything. He's lost his family, he's lost his wealth, he's lost all of his livestock, everything, all of his servants. And his friends come to him. His wife is also there, and his friends mourn with him for 7 days. And there's total silence. No one says anything because of how deep Job's grief is. And then after 7 days, Job speaks up, and he actually has a lament. That's what Job chapter 3 is it's Job's lament. With Job's lament, we're not going to read the whole thing. We're not going to read the whole thing of any of these sections, but we do have certain verses picked out and highlighted that we will focus on, that articulate the general ideas that are being communicated. So Job's lament can be pretty well summarized in verses 11, 16, and 24 to 26. But then also, we're going to read Eliphaz's response. Eliphaz is one of Job's friends, and he actually responds to Job's grief. And so this is going to be the first section of the dialogues that we're going to deal with today. So you can go ahead and we're going to do voices. Well, not like made up voices, but Jordan's going to be Job, and I'll be Eliphaz.
Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Or why was I not hidden away in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? For sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil.
But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? So that's a pretty brief summary of Job chapter 3 through 4, verse 6. And there's a lot being said there. It gets really dark, as you can clearly see. There's some things that we just didn't read, obviously, but some of it's pretty rough. Um, we highlighted those to articulate the general sense that's being talked about here. So in Job chapter 3 and 4, at least the beginning of chapter 4, they wrestle with this idea of lament. Is lament, maybe, I don't want to say is lament a good thing, but is lament something that is bad? Which Eliphaz actually tends to say, which is essentially, well, he says, but now trouble comes to you and you're discouraged. It strikes you and you're dismayed. He says it as though it's something bad. Like, why are you lamenting? Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? As if to say, Job, you're righteous, then why are you lamenting? Like, those two cannot be the same. You cannot both be righteous and lament. Like, something is wrong there. And so the general sense of what we're saying, I think a question that we could ask is is optimism a requirement of righteousness? Or another way to put that would be, do we need to have a things will get better mentality as Christians? Maybe that's a good starting place for this segment of Job. Jordan, what do you think?
The answer, I think, from a biblical perspective, is a bit of a yes and no. Now, in light of Job, it's a bit of a different discussion, right? Because I mean, in this conversation, we don't really have a time and place. It's really just asking questions. So I think the point of it is to ask the
Mhm.
question. So I'm gonna ask it explicitly in my context. So in my context, I have the idea of the hope of a resurrection. Now, when I read Job's passage, what I interpreted it as, or at least what I heard him saying, was a legitimate question. He just literally lost all of his children, his entire life, and his wealth. The only thing he kept was his wife. Um, and so just it's pretty meaningful. And I we were joking around in pre-show, and I made a comment that I think is actually really helpful. Like, Job's basically saying, rather than, instead of, like, you ever heard it said, like, it's better to have loved than lost than to never love at all. Job's like, yeah, no, hot take. It's better to not just died rather than lose any of that. Like, dying is better and more preferable than living and losing, or even living and not having it. Just be dead. And I was like, wow, it's pretty dark. So, but the interesting thing though is that Eliphaz kind of comes to him in the middle of this turmoil. Like, this is his friend, right? And the first thing he says, he's like, hey,
Mhm.
if you're truly blameless, like, shouldn't your piety be your confidence, and your blamelessness, you're like your way, like, ways of hope?
Mhm.
Like, hey, cheer up, it's gonna be better, because, like, you're a good person. So, like, God always gives back to the good people, right? Like, am I right? Like, type
Mhm.
situation. And as I was thinking about it in our context, like, I was thinking about, like, the church traditions that I grew up in, and, like, how when bad things would happen, like, it's almost a default answer that someone always does is they pull this card. They're like, well, someday we won't feel any pain because we're going to go home to Jesus and all the stuff. You know what I mean? Like, on a funeral, when someone dies of cancer when they're
Mhm.
way too young, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or when someone has a heart attack and they shouldn't have, and as nice as that sounds, I feel like it's really hurtful and patronizing, because it doesn't allow you to feel what's going on in the present. And I think that two things can be true. So in one sense, should we be looking forward, hopeful? Yeah, absolutely. Like, I can't not be hopeful and rest in the idea that one day we're going to be resurrected people, and that, like, that vision of the resurrection. Like, I always tell Morgan that, like, I think about this often. I'll get a walk my grandpa's apple orchard with him. My favorite dog, I'll
Mhm.
see her again, right? Because I don't think it's explicitly clear in the biblical text that animals are not resurrected. I think that's implied, but that's just my opinion and my interpretation. I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again. My point is, though, I'll get to walk my grandpa's apple orchard, and I'll get to see his love for nature in a way that I've never got to experience it, because he was so much older when I was a kid. I'll get to do that with him someday.
Mhm.
Physically walk, not just, like, sing the chorus of Hallelujah as we, like, emanate into the person of God, like something meaningful, like my created life will have purpose and meaning, and I'll be able to understand things. Like, I can rest in that hope and that excitement, that anticipation, but I can still feel in the moment, like, really frustrated. Um, and I wonder if maybe that's, like, the middle ground of the dialogue, or what it's trying
Mhm.
to get you to ask about, or maybe one side is better than the other. Like, it's okay to totally feel what you have to feel, versus, like, Eliphaz is a total butthead, for lack of a better word, for coming in with his like, well, shouldn't you be hopeful? You know, you know what I mean? Like what a jerk. You know, read the
Yeah.
room, Eliphaz. Like
Yeah.
things are happening, you know? Like he's like, does that make sense though, Ben, what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, that's a really good point because it does challenge those two views. Maybe we can wrestle with this a little bit. I feel like it challenges, on the one hand, you have Job's side, which Job is trying to live authentically, right? We have that idea that's really common nowadays. I don't know if it's becoming a larger idea, but it's certainly grown a lot, which is uh, the phrase I heard is authenticity is the new hypocrisy, right? So in the church, it's like, well, I'm just trying to be authentic, right? Well, this is just who I am. Like, this is my attitude. This is my personality. This is the situation that I'm in. And to be anything else and to try and be anything else is somehow inherently immoral, right? So like I'm broken right now and I'm upset. And that's just me being authentic. And I think Job critiques that. The book of Job critiques that through Eliphaz. But I think it also critiques the opposite idea, which is what you're saying, which is, well, just be happy. Like there's no point in being
Or move
sad. There's no point
forward.
in being upset. Just be happy. Yeah. Just forget about it. Whatever. Move on.
Focus on the
Like it's all
future.
in the
You know what I
past.
mean? Like this is all
Yeah.
temporary, you know? Man, Eliphaz really can't read a room the way we read him. He really,
Yeah, for real. He really
um,
can't.
very insensitive friend, but well-meaning. Because here's the counterpoint, though, Ben. Like here's where he's right, though, is that like from our
Mhm.
perspective as Christians, he's right because there is. I don't obviously like we don't necessarily believe that like your piety is your hope. You know what I mean? But we
Mhm.
believe that like our faithfulness to God, that He's equally faithful to us, and like our hope is found in His sacrifice, and as long as we plead His blood, right, and follow His commands, follows that will be. I guess maybe to some extent. Oh, now we're getting into James works in faith. Regardless, the point remains that we have some sense of hope, and so like there is a truth element of truth in what Eliphaz is saying though, is that there like there is a sense of hope there, and that like maybe Job shouldn't be so despaired that life isn't worth living because you know God is God and He can like your piety like you He can give more back to you. You know what I mean? Like point is though that like you know what I mean and like there's an element of truth to that. Like if He is God, like He can do that. You know, and I think Eliphaz like needs to be given some credit as much as we're slamming him right now. I mean, I probably would
Yeah.
tend to lean on the side of Job because I have another counterpoint for Eliphaz, but I don't know. I think that's fair. What do you think? Just I'm gonna stop talking, let you jump in. But I think that's true. Like I think we can't discount totally the idea of hope.
Right. And I totally agree with that. Especially in this context where the issue is essentially to do with hope, right? And Job has almost lost all of it, though not entirely, because towards the end you sort of see glimpses of the hope that he still has. But that's a separate point. But yeah, I I would agree, and I think that's fair. Yeah.
So my counterpoint from Job to Eliphaz is simply this: well, if I'm resting in my piety, dude, like I was pious and he did all this and I still hurt and it's tangible hurt and you may not be able to understand it or feel it, but I do. And I feel in a way that maybe you can't
Mhm.
understand or feel. And it still burdens me. And it's burdening me to the point where I'd rather just be dead than feel this psychic pain, right? Like to deal with this like psychic just weight of just, I don't even, there's not even, I don't have a word for it. Just, bleh, you know what I mean? Like this like heavy depression that's like hanging him down. Um, you know, and his counterpoint is simply like that, like, yeah, like I hear you, but like I was those things. And we can affirm that that's true based on the text, right? It says that Job was righteous and blameless.
Mhm.
And then all these things happen. So,
Yeah.
like, what is the whole point? Is he waiting to get more back at the end? But, like, what about the things that he had? Were they just not important? Like, what's the, you know what I mean? And so, like,
Mhm.
I think that's the one thing that you have to ask about Eliphaz. And it's interesting because I wonder, and maybe even this is getting too far off the rails, but part of me wonders if maybe it's even asking us about, like, the way we think about God's providence. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Like, if it's like, which,
And
go ahead.
yeah, in what regard
Well, like,
has to do with God's
yeah,
providence?
like, so for Eliphaz, like the whole, at least if I'm reading it correctly, the idea is that, well, no, like he can give you back more, like he can give those things to you in a different way. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But if they were gifts from God in the first place, it's a weird place to be, that like God gave you this gift and like blessed you for being obedient. You're still obedient, then he takes away said gifts to make you wait and suffer and pain to give you better gifts. It just feels really, I don't know, monkey's paw. That makes sense, but
Yeah.
not monkey's paw, but like painful for no reason. I don't know. Does that, you understand? Like it
Right.
doesn't feel like there's not a structural, understandable way. And to like argue that God's ways are higher, I feel like is a bit disingenuous. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, I mean, you
Yeah.
can say that, like, yeah, theoretically, yes, but like that assumes a whole lot of different things. Like that one, it, you have to make some pretty bold statements about God's character. I think that a lot of times when we say, his ways are higher, he can do whatever he wants, he's God, it forces, like, it's a way for us to get ourselves off the hook of asking questions about who God is as he's revealed himself to us through
Hmm.
his son. But if his son is the revelation of who he is, and that's how we understand like the concept, like who God is, then like if that's truly the case, then like we need to be really careful what we say about that person's character, because we only have some pretty specific examples of it in the person of Jesus Christ. And it doesn't seem like the person of Jesus Christ would go to Job in the way Eliphaz did and be like, hey man, buck up. Tomorrow's going to be better. Hang in there, pal. Like it doesn't, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it doesn't feel like that. Like it's not, you know what I'm saying? Like it just seems kind of contradictory. Like that's not how he interacts with
Right.
really anybody. I don't know. So I just feel like Job's got a
Hmm.
solid counterpoint, but I don't think Eliphaz is wrong. Cool. No, I'm not saying anything, but maybe that's the
Yeah.
point.
So this actually reminds me of a discussion I had once in one of my pastoral ministry classes where we essentially reflected on the perspective that trying to be happy and pursuing happiness is actually a sinful thing to do, because trying to be happy and like making that a goal in life, or even in some instances trying to be in a state of happiness, is actually forcing yourself to not acknowledge the reality that you're in. It's forcing yourself to not acknowledge sometimes like the sin that surrounds us or the brokenness that surrounds us, and we become willfully ignorant of the things that are happening in the world. Like we become willfully ignorant of the suffering of others or even the suffering of ourselves, and that itself is also like a major flaw. And so I think that's sort of what you're saying. Like that's a counterpoint that Job is making to Eliphaz, which is like, I'm suffering and there's a lot of brokenness right now, and it's actually wrong to try and pretend as though that's not significant and we can just ignore it and just force ourselves to move past it, where there is something
Yeah.
that needs to be done here, if nothing else than to just acknowledge this is messed up and like this is really painful right now.
No, I think that's a fair critique. I wonder how much more boring and short Job would be if his friends took Job's advice and just sat there quietly with him and lamented. Um, how, how dark would the book get? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I hear you, Ben. Well, the tie I was going to ask you, because I want to make sure we're getting your point, is that like Eliphaz is
Mm,
just kind of saying like move on, like you have to like push forward, and you're equating that to like the idea of like our pursuit of happiness, and like how like there may be an
mm,
underlying problem in our lives or frustration in our life, and like we fill that by like, I don't know, maybe even consumption of things, like whether it be drugs, alcohol, or even more menial things like, you know, uh, like those celebrities that like get married every year and they're like on wife number 8, and you're like,
mm.
how? Like truly, like how? You know what I mean? Like your lawyer must make so much money off you strictly for the prenups. Like it's probably more cost efficient to just let her take half at this point. You know what I mean? Like that's really brutal. I'm sorry, but you get the point. You know what I mean? Like they just hop from the thing to the next. Like I don't know, some kind of hype beast or something. Is that what you're saying? Like there's a similarity
Kind
there.
of. I don't. Yeah, similarity. But maybe Job is speaking more against this segment of Job is speaking against the avoidance of things, maybe
Mm.
like the avoidance of hurt. So this is something I deal with whenever I do funerals, and I've mentioned it before. Like I prefer doing funerals to weddings because weddings are very easy for people. Like the emotions involved and like the spirit of the whole event is like something that people enjoy. Like they want to celebrate, they want to be happy. they want to like, see these dreams come true and stuff. At a funeral, it's the total opposite, and that's why I enjoy it, because I have an opportunity to actually help people confront something that people do not want to confront. And I've seen it so many times where at a funeral, like people are there, they're sitting in the room, like even in an open casket or whether someone was cremated, like they see the remains of someone, but they just try so hard to pretend as though that's not happening. Like, or they just want to move on. Like, no, I don't want to think about it. Everything's fine. I'm just going to move on with my life, yada, yada, yada. And what I try to intentionally do, sometimes I even say it, is I'm just like, we are here to focus on the reality that this person is no longer with us. Like, even like, yeah, we'll see them again, but they're not here right now. Like, we can't just wait for them to walk into the room. That's not going to happen. We can't call them up on the phone. We can't send them an email or text message. They're gone. And we need to confront that. And like that
You're
is
fun at
so hard
parties.
for people to do. Yeah, I know. I put the fun in funeral, that's for sure. But but at the same time, like confronting that reality is such a healthy thing to do, and it's a necessary thing to do. But people actually create a lot of unhealthiness for themselves by trying to avoid it. I'm sorry. I know I'm still trying, like talking like I'm serious, and
No,
Jordan's
no.
just
I'm
laughing
sorry.
and
That
that's
was well
okay.
played, sir. Well
But
played.
I yeah, but that's just like how I'm applying what Job's doing here, which is just he's actually confronting a reality of facing his loss. Like he is not pretending that everything's going to be okay. And maybe it won't be okay. And that's something that Job's wrestling with. You know what? Maybe things won't be okay from here on out. Maybe this is just going to be my lot in life. Maybe this is all I'm going to be left with. And I don't think there's anything wrong about the fact that Job's doing that, which Eliphaz seems to be implying here, which is that Job is wrong for even doing that in the first place. I mean, think about it. They've been sitting there for 7 days. This is the first thing Job says, and Eliphaz immediately just shuts him down. Like that's kind of cold.
No.
And even if he does
I
have somewhat of a point, like that's pretty harsh.
have this like mental image of these like frat guys. It's like, bro, I hear you, but you need to suck it up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, but also another interesting thing about Job is that Job as a whole is somewhat of a response to the morality of Proverbs and Psalms. And what you see a lot in
Interesting.
Psalms, for example, is a lot of these instances where whoever wrote the psalm is talking about how they're in such a desperate place, like how much pain they're in, whatever. But then they constantly follow it up with, but God's going to take care of me. Like everything's going to be fine, yada, yada, yada. And Job is almost saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't just jump to that conclusion and pretend like everything's okay now and just sort of ignore the reality that we're in. Maybe we just need to rest here a little bit. And I think there's something valuable to be said about that. And I'm not saying that the Psalms or Proverbs are wrong. Maybe it's our application of the Psalms and Proverbs that needs to be in check.
Well, maybe that's the point of Job to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, very fair. But yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I hear Psalms or Proverbs, a lot of it is in light of that. Like, I don't know where you are this morning. Like, you know how they start church services. I don't know where you are this morning, but, and they try to cast it as like, but we can just let all that go and we can just be happy right now and pretend as though all that doesn't exist.
I think I've been to one service and I thought it was really refreshing. The guy was like, I know a lot of you brought a lot of baggage to service today. And the guy was like, I can't remember what he said exactly, but he was like, and I want you to keep it. And I want us as we go through the service to work on like laying it down at God's feet, which I didn't love the whole idea of casting it off, but I like the idea that like you bring it in and that you don't ignore it, but like you also understand like,
Hmm.
okay, maybe we ought to like, if we're here and trusting that God will work in those circumstances, like at least try the method of casting at God's feet, which I guess to some extent is fine. But I the implication I think could be dangerous because it could be like, okay, he'll take care of it, so stop worrying. But I don't think that's what he meant based on how
Yeah.
he brought it up. Because I think he wanted us to acknowledge that, like, hey, like don't leave it at the door. That's okay. You need to bring it with you, and that's the thing that you're gonna go back to. You know what I mean? But I agree. I think that whole like put it down for an hour as we sing worship songs, and then you'll have this emotional experience, and you got to go back to your crappy life. Have fun. See you next week. Like, is this not
Yeah.
perfect or good?
Hmm. Is this also a bit of a critique of the revivalist uh, movement,
I'll critique the
which I know we sort
revivalist
of talked about
movement.
that in another video, which is like the idea that you can just come to church and there's actually an easy solution to the problems that you're going with, which is just to leave it at the altar, quote unquote.
Yeah, leave sprinkle some Jesus on it. Rub some Jesus on it. It's
Yeah.
fine.
I mean, let's be real though. Like that is still a very prevalent idea in a lot of churches, right? Well, just lay your burden down. My goodness, what are you doing? What are you carrying it for? Just lay it down, and then you'll never have to think about it again. It'll all be taken care of.
So
You're fine.
can I get a little critical, but not in a mean way?
Yeah, that's fine.
I feel like I grew up in that church, like word for word. Like that was how we understood holiness. Like that's all. Like
Mhm.
I don't think my youth pastor was one of those people, but I think that like the church culture was such that like that's how they understood living a good life. And like you just got to lay it down, man. Like you just got to lay it down. And like there was a pastor we had, and I don't want to be critical of him, but he actually got a lot of criticism because he had an altar call every week because all the time, lay it down, 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 lay it, use all everything. You know what I mean? Like come ask for forgiveness
Mhm.
or come bring your burdens here and so he can take them or come down and make a commitment. Just whatever it was, like come down and do this like revivalist thing, which was like, just let your burdens down. And like that's why I made the joke of rub some Jesus on it. You know what I mean? It's like when your dad, like when you when you fall and scrape your knee, and your dad's like rub some dirt on it, and you're like that seems unsafe and unsanitary. Well, maybe it's true for this too. Maybe like running down to the altar and throwing it away and not actually dealing with that stuff is a little unsafe and unsanitary. And I'm sure we've all like,
Yeah.
okay, so this is going to get really bad, but like, my wife didn't grow up in a Christian home. She was brought to church by other friends, and it's been a lifelong struggle for her to understand like the Christian subculture because that was always like stuff you saw at times. So when she went to a Christian school,
Yeah.
I think she was kind of like really thrown off at times. And even in some ways she tried to participate in it, but I think she always felt uncomfortable. One thing she gets really frustrated with is
Hmm.
like, and this is something that we beat like the people beat to death, but I think when you think about it in this context makes sense. Like she's like, I get really tired of like the hypocritical stuff. You know what I mean? And for her, it's like you don't have to just pretend that it's okay, or like we don't just have to like Christianize and Jesusize it. You know what I mean? Like things can just be bad,
Mhm.
and that's okay. And I think that she feels that way is because she grew up in a household when things were bad. Like it was just that way. Like people were just like that really just sucks. Very sorry. And I think that our temptation as
Mhm.
Christians, especially those within the revivalist movements, like holiness movements in particular, like we have a temptation, like you were saying, Ben, to be like, lay it down, put it down at your feet. And I feel like that you brought up a really good sub point of criticism there. I think that's something that's really valid to ask
Mhm.
because like I don't necessarily think that it's bad to like the idea that you need to lay something down at Jesus' feet.
Right.
But at the same time,
Mhm.
like to what extent is it just you trying to not deal with it and like this like basically what's the word I'm looking for? Discard, right?
Yeah.
That trauma and that anger and that hurt so that you don't have to
Mhm.
deal with it anymore.
Yeah. And I wonder if some of that is a change in terminology that's led to a change in theology.
Ooh.
Because the idea of, you're right, the idea of laying something down in and of itself is like, that's a biblical thing to do, right? Lay something down. But the idea is that you surrender it. It's not that you give it up and you just forfeit all connection to it. The idea is that you surrender it to Jesus, let him do what he wants with it, which most of the time involves us in the process. Like he works with us like together in whatever that situation is. It's not that we give it up, but the idea of laying something down, like that terminology implies like you leave it there and then you just don't touch it again. Which I wonder if that's led to some of that theology of whenever you lay something down at Jesus, you never have to deal with it again. It's like, well, that's not accurate. Like that's a change in terminology, or that's a use of terminology that's led to a change in theology. In my opinion, now I haven't studied this. That's just my assumption because that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But like that's the thing, like, and that's what I tried to preach, which is whenever you lay something down, whenever you surrender something, you you don't get to just get rid of it. Like that's when the work really begins. That's not where the work ends with that thing. That's where it starts.
To in the spirit of like understand the dialogue, let's try to think it from the flip side of like the lay it down culture and like let it go. To some extent,
Hmm.
it does apply to things like are holding on of like if you've done something wrong and it's eating at you, at some point,
Yeah.
maybe it is healthy to say, I don't know this, I'm not a psychiatrist. Uh, it is healthy to say, you need to, what is, you need to cast that in. What is there actually a verse that says Jesus cast sins in the sea of forgetfulness, or did my mom make that up my whole life?
Geez, I have no idea, but I'm gonna be a total millennial and look it up right now.
Okay. But anyway, the idea that like, hey, that like it's been forgiven, like you just need to let it go. You know what I mean? Um,
Oh yeah, it's in Micah.
okay. But the point is like simply this, right? Like we're not necessarily talking about that verse as much as we're talking about the idea that like maybe there is some times where it's okay to like say, okay, I need to leave this here, even as like a metaphorical statement. You know what I mean? Like I need to leave this like guilt I've been carrying around at some point because I've been carrying it around for a long time, and it's not even healthy processing anymore. It's just an unnecessary burden. You know what I mean? I don't. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know if that place exists, or even like if that's a realistic advice. I don't think I personally would ever feel comfortable giving said advice. I would never tell somebody that, but I would refer them to a professional that could maybe help them sort that out. But I don't know. I think that I'm at least trying to acknowledge the reality that that is a possibility, right? Because I don't want to totally like be the guy that's like everything that I grew up with is wrong, like it's not the case. Um, and to some
Right.
extent, like I think there's some value in the idea that like, you know, you stop trying to carry burdens. Like, when you think about like high school and like, well, really high school revivals or like camps and stuff, like you think about them talking about like, don't try so hard, you don't have to earn your salvation or whatever, resting in that eternal security, teaching kids how to do that. But like, stop trying to earn your salvation by being more Christian and reading your Bible all the time and like going to see you at the pool and like, you know what I mean? Like doing all that. Like you can just be and rest in the
Yeah.
promise of God by knowing that you made that commitment and being obedient to what He's asked you to do, right? And just that's
Hmm.
it. Like I think there's value in that, right? Because that's laying down something that's an unnecessary
Yeah.
burden. But at the same time, well, no, I think that's the
Mhm.
counterpoint. That has to be to some extent the counterpoint. Sorry, does that make sense, or do you think that we're talking past each other?
No, I think it works. Like that is a valid point, and certainly, yeah, I agree. There are things that you just have to let go of, and just leave it there. But to say, but yeah, it seems like the more general thing that we're trying to get at is, but to use that and apply it for everything is a
Yeah,
mistake, right? To say of every burden that you carry, you have to lay it down and never touch it again is wrong, right? Like so, let's say like you run into like a traumatic experience. You're just like, well, just forget about it. Just lay it down. Just forget about it. Don't go back there again. It's like, no, there actually needs to be like healing that takes place, and that can only come through a lot of hard work, and that hard work like actually has to be done. Certainly, Christ can help you with that, along with the therapist, which is a good thing. But there's still work that needs to be done. You can't just leave it there and act like it's going to be okay,
well
which
said.
is sort of what Eliphaz seems to be saying. Like Job, just get over it. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, or like, hey, trust that like it's going to be better because you are obedient. I'm not doubting that you're obedient. Maybe it doesn't matter why this happened. What matters is that like ultimately it'll get back. But that's interesting though, because like I was thinking about Job, like hearing that and like what is like your gut response would be like, yo man, kick rocks, like dude, like you know what I
Exactly.
mean? Like, come on, man. Like I was
Yeah.
good, and then all this crap happened to me. Like that's what do you think I'm mad about? You know what I mean? Like, why do you think I'm here?
Right.
But like, I don't know. I guess not to be devil's advocate, but I wonder if maybe Eliphaz has got a point to this extent that like, is there something inherently wrong with trying to be faithful in that moment and saying, okay, like maybe if you're in a place where you can accept that, like, I don't know, would that inherently wrong
Inherently wrong to
to just
what?
to say, okay, I will trust. I'm hurting, but that's it. You're right. It's not useful to hurt anymore. So I'll just trust and I'll be obedient and like I'll basically have confidence that like it's going to be better. That's my hope.
Hmm. Well, I guess we'll get an answer to that question towards the end of the book when God responds, because we still have like 30. Oh, well, let's see, 37 chapters left, and a lot of it is Job getting even more dark. So I
So
guess we'll find
stay
out.
tuned for that.
But regardless, Job does not take Eliphaz's advice. That's the takeaway.
Spoilers. He doesn't care for that advice.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the PB&J podcast. If you like this episode, be sure to leave a like, also leave a comment, subscribe, and share. That'll really help us out. And let us know what your thoughts are on this subject. And also, if you have any ideas of topics you'd like us to talk about. If you want to reach out to us, you can on all of our social medias, as well as email. You can email us at official.pbjpodcast@gmail.com. And we will see you next time.